crisis to the end of the Cold War and talk about the lessons learned from this nuclear arms race in 20 minutes. Normally, it would take me about 2 to 3 hours, so I will try to condense. So what I will try to do is focus on two very important periods of time. One is known to everybody, but a lot of it is still unknown, is the Cuban Missile Crisis, which I will argue is relevant to what we have happening in the world today. And the other focus for today will be the end of the Cold War in early 1990s, where we have an era of unprecedented cooperation between the United States and the Soviet Union. So one bad episode and one good episode, but I will start with the lessons. And I will argue that there were lessons from the history of the nuclear weapons between the two superpowers, the arms race, but they were not really learned. The main lesson, it seems to me, from all my study of the nuclear crises and arms race and decision making is the need for empathy. And let me remind you that empathy is not liking the other or sympathizing with what they're doing, but just trying to step into their shoes and then from those shoes look at yourself and see what you see. And most human beings are unable to do that. And especially at the levels of government, it's very, very hard to do that because we always feel like we are the good guys. Therefore, well, they know we're the good guys. They know we want to attack. So why are they doing that? Okay. In crises, there's always uncertainty of information. McNamara in a famous documentary talked about the fog of war, and I think it was very present and obvious in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Another lesson that comes throughout the history of nuclear arms race that cooperation always works, toughness doesn't. President Kennedy, almost exactly 60 years ago, June 10, 1963, said one of the lessons of the Cuban Missile Crisis was to never push your adversary into a corner. A very wise thing to say. In all nuclear crises, we have illusion of control, while actually, in reality, control is slipping out of the leader's hands. What is important in every tension, especially tension involving nuclear weapons, is building trust and transparency between adversaries. And we can see this in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Also, in all nuclear crises, we have misperception of others' intentions. Just this is so prevalent, misreading of the adversary's intentions. It happened on both sides. I'm sure it's happening now on the Chinese side, and certainly it's happening on our part when we're trying to read Chinese intentions, Russians' intentions, and so on. So I will just mention, because I prepared this slide, the important things about the early history of nuclear weapons and the Cold War. The Soviet Union was just coming out of World War II with incredible destruction, incredible human suffering, loss of 20 million people, a lot of them due to the leadership by Stalin, by its own inhuman system. But the use of nuclear bomb in Hiroshima had an incredible psychological effect. It is hard to imagine how deep and profound that effect was because the Soviet Union was still far away, far behind the United States in building nuclear weapons. Stalin ordered kind of a crash course to get the bomb, and the sensation was the United States has this weapon. They just bombed Hiroshima. If they don't like what we're doing, they can do it to us. And this was an important perception to keep in mind how the Soviets felt around the beginning of the nuclear war. And then, a lot of people did talk here and will talk about the nuclear war planning, which is all kind of crazy, overkill, science fiction. Discussion with strange words like countervalue and counterforce. It doesn't really matter. either it's counter cities or counter force. Everybody in the end gets killed. If you bomb East Berlin to punish the Soviets, what happens then with West Berlin and your allies? It's just inhuman kind of logic. So now we actually go to the Cuban Missile Crisis. It is a crisis that we studied and studied and studied in school. I was at Moscow State University in 1988. So, the third year of Gorbachev in power, opened this glasnost told this, our international, actually foreign policy decision-making lecturer who was just excellent and so progressive, comes into class and he says, I'm going to tell you something that no other historians have yet heard in this country. Dead silence in class. And he says, we put nuclear weapons in Cuba in 1962, right? 1988. Until then, nobody in the Soviet Union, I mean general public, of course, inside the leadership, it was known, knew about what the Cuban Missile Crisis was about. That's about secrecy. In 1988, we suddenly began talking about why the Cuban Missile Crisis was so dangerous. And we're still discovering how dangerous it was. And each new discovery shows that we came so close to mutual annihilation. Just a couple of things to remember. Cuba almost became a nuclear power. Didn't we know about it? No, we didn't. Only in 1992, at a conference where I was present, and I actually was organizing the Soviet delegation that overnight before the conference became the Russian delegation, that came with documents to show that the Soviets brought not just strategic nuclear weapons, medium range and intermediate range nuclear weapons, also tactical nuclear weapons. And that almost 100 tactical nuclear warheads, which they were planning to leave in Cuba and gradually transfer to the Cubans. What would Cubans do with them? Well, we don't know. Soviet submarines had nuclear torpedoes. The United States had no idea. The United States had no idea that Soviets brought the tactical nuclear weapons. Information was always limited and uncertain. And the Soviet local commanders in Cuba had the ability to launch tactical nuclear weapons. This is something that gives you an insight into how limited the decision-making was in XCOM, because it was limited, it was restricted by this very incomplete information. So, this is just a cute little chart that comes from a Russian source. I like it because it gives you a very graphic comparison of the missile gap, right? When President Kennedy was running for the office, he campaigned on the missile gap, that the United States is falling behind the Soviet Union in missiles. Well, here it is the representation how far the missile gap went in the other direction. Just to give you a quick comparison, this is the number, the total number of warheads, the nuclear warheads that could reach the United States in the Soviet Union, and that is the number of the U.S. warheads capable of reaching the Soviet Union. So there was a huge missile gap, and the Soviets knew how deep it was and in which direction it was. The Americans, however, thought that they were behind the Soviet Union, although, at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, they were aware of the direction of the missile gap. So, the traditional narrative from which, at the time, the United States drew lessons is that the United States deployed missiles in Cuba to put pressure on the United States and West Berlin to redress the strategic balance. Completely wrong. It's misreading of the other's intentions. the deployment was very limited. This is most important, that the crisis was resolved positively in favor of the United States because John Kennedy was tough and resolute. He did not compromise with Khrushchev. He pushed him back. We went eyeball to eyeball, and the other person blinked, and that the crisis really didn't have any role for Cuba. It was between the superpowers, and Cuba was basically a parking lot. The crisis lasted 13 days, and then everything was removed, taken back, complete U.S. victory. Now, in the Soviet Union, they had their own interpretation of the crisis, which said the Americans were going to invade Cuba. We put our missiles, we pushed the Americans back, we revealed their aggressive intentions, they folded, and promised never to invade Cuba. Nothing was said about nuclear weapons in Cuba and that they had to move them back. Well, the reality was, and this is what we know at this point, there's possibility that other things will be revealed. In addition to those medium and intermediate range missiles, there were 43,000 combat troops. There were warheads for R-14 missiles. And there were, as I already said, almost 100 tactical nuclear weapons on the island. So the actual updated narrative, I think, reads the resolution much more accurately. That the resolution of the crisis was only possible through compromise. And in fact, if you read the XCOM minutes, which is a great read, you can see that Kennedy mentions that almost from the very beginning. That, the Turkey trade, the pledge to never invade Cuba, and this intense relationship that Kennedy and Khrushchev are in. They're exchanging letters. They, in some strange way, they start coming closer to each other as individuals. And the reason that they're able to do this, I would argue, is trust. There is this look into the nuclear precipice, and these two leaders realized they were about to abolish civilization. And so they trusted each other. In fact, when the Americans demanded that the Turkey deal, the removal of Jupiters from Turkey and Italy in exchange of the Soviets removing their nuclear weapons from Cuba, Americans demanded that this deal should be kept secret. Well, it was very beneficial for Khrushchev to tell his domestic audience, look, I forced the United States to remove the Jupiters. He didn't. And in fact, the deal remained secret until 1989, when at a conference in Moscow, the former Soviet ambassador Reagan said, well, Americans, why don't you come clean? There was this deal, right? And you told us to keep it secret. And Americans said, yeah, actually, there was a deal. And that was the deal, the compromise that resolved the crisis. And I talk about Castro being an important actor, but we don't have to. So, but I would really like to talk about this. We know two exact, very realistic, not theoretical, scenarios of how the nuclear exchange couldn't have started. So most of Kennedy's advisors, especially the military, were suggesting airstrike or airstrikes followed by an invasion of Cuba. In Cuba, there were Soviet commanders who had control of nuclear weapons, which they could use in a situation of U.S. military landing on Cuba. So it's a very realistic scenario. If the XCOM decided to do a strike and amphibious landing in Cuba, then the U.S. soldiers coming onto the island would be met with nuclear fire, and the president most likely would have to respond in kind. And then the second scenario has been written a lot lately. The commanders of the submarines could launch their nuclear torpedo. They were in the conditions where they did not have any communication with Moscow for several, 2 days actually. At the time, they thought that they might be already at war, and they were given orders when they were leaving to use nuclear weapons if they're attacked, if the war has started and there's a hole in the hull. If they fired their nuclear torpedo at a U.S. destroyer or aircraft carrier, Kennedy would have to retaliate. Try to explain these within the framework of deterrence theory. So this is the commander of one of the ships that went to Cuba. This is Nikolai Beloborodov, the commander of Indigirka that brought the warheads, the nuclear warheads to Cuba. And it's just a little illustration. So I'm skipping over the detente of the 1970s, but for those of you who are interested, what's interesting is that the moment the Soviets and the Americans decide to talk to each other, they produce huge breakthroughs. Several major treaties signed, ABM treaties signed, anti-ballistic treaty, which was a cornerstone of the global arms control, I would say, certainly U.S. Soviet Russian arms control until the United States withdrew from it. But this is something also that I would skip. If you're interested, we can talk about it. But this, I have to say personally, the only time in my life that I felt fear of nuclear war was in November '83, when it seemed like situation was getting worse and worse and worse with every day. The December 1st, 1983 is my first day of Moscow State University. I go in, the Soviets shoot the airliner, and it feels like then we're really creeping into some major conflict. And in the end of 1983, the Soviets walk out of all negotiations, and it becomes really dark right before the sunrise. And now I'd like to spend just a little more time on the end of the Cold War. So new leadership comes to power in the Soviet Union, and among other things, his main focus, the main focus of Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev, was to reform the Soviet economy and society. And to do that, he had to try to end the Cold War, end the arms race, at least stop it at that level. And one of the things that he believes in is that nuclear weapons are evil. In fact, he tries to promote this program of elimination of nuclear weapons. An interesting coincidence, he launches this program on January 15, 1986. That's the day when Sig Hecker becomes director of Los Alamos. The United States does not respond to the program because they take it as propaganda, but it was not. Then in 1986, as we talked about it, Chernobyl blew up, and that made the threat very real, tactile, and present, and strengthened this abolitionism in Gorbachev. He found out that Reagan was also an abolitionist. And these two people who represented such different social systems that blamed each other for everything bad in the world, called each other's aggressors, they found a lot in common. And this sudden opportunity brought about the summit in 1986 in Reykjavik, where the two presidents almost agreed on abolishing nuclear weapons. Reagan agreed to move toward abolition. This was his best hope, and yet he could not give up SDI. And Gorbachev also wanted to move to abolish nuclear weapons, but he could not accept that SDI would be continued in some form. So Again, this is a gross misreading of the intentions. To the Soviets, the SDI seemed like, oh, this is the United States moving toward first strike. They're going to put weapons, nuclear weapons, in space. And therefore, it's another blitzkrieg against the Soviet Union. Because by having this impenetrable shield, they essentially can hit us with first strike, and the Soviet Union then would not be able to retaliate. So they really believed that it was not the defensive program, it was the cover for the offensive program. Lack of empathy, lack of trust. But this is what Gorbachev and Reagan started to build. Here in 1987, the the United States proposed that back in 1981, the zero proposal, telling the Soviets, well, let's remove all the missiles, all mid-range and intermediate-range missiles in Europe. And the Soviets said, oh, it means that we eliminate all ours and you eliminate a couple. No, that's not good. In 1987, Gorbachev accepts this proposal, which is so unequal for the Soviet Union. Look at this. If you're in a democratic society, you come to your legislature. Well, the Soviet Union, of course, was not a democratic society, and legislature was just a rubber stamp. But imagine you come to your Congress and you say, okay, we're going to sign this treaty under which we destroy 889 intermediate range missiles and 957 shorter range missiles. And by the way, among the 957, we are including our newest technologically best 239 missiles that we're just deployed. What does your Congress tell you? There's your next election goes out. The United States destroys 677 and 169 respectively. It is the most unequal treaty in the history of nuclear weapons, but it made Europe safe, it made the United States and the Soviet Union safe, and it built an incredible amount of trust because it comes with unprecedented inspections. The Soviets agreed to anytime, anywhere inspections. And actually, this treaty and the experience of inspections then works in the 1990s as a basis for further very deep cooperation. So this is Reagan and Gorbachev in Reykjavik before the final session when they discuss the elimination of nuclear weapons, and it fails. And that's them after they just blew the biggest opportunity of their life. All right. Yep, wrapping up. This is the last thing I will talk about. So I experimentally found out that people simply don't know about something called the Nunn-Lugar program or the cooperative threat reduction. When I teach at American University at master's level, in my first class, every time I ask my students, so tell me what was the Nunn-Lugar Cooperative Threat Reduction Program blank. These are the people who come to get masters in international relations. This is the most unprecedented program of cooperation, experience of cooperation between the United States and the Soviet Union, and Russia. If the Soviet Union was disintegrated, these two senators had an incredible idea. Why don't we use the money from the defense budget to help the Soviet Union disarm, right? A lot of people say, well, why do you need to help your adversary? But these people and the individuals who were participants of that program, of which Sim Hacker was kind of a model participant, they were able to help the Soviet Union dismantle, safely store, and reprocess their nuclear weapons, pull nuclear weapons out of Kazakhstan, Ukraine, and Belarus deactivate chemical weapons. They did not do as well on the biological weapons. But here, look at this. This is just unbelievable. This is 3 defense ministers: the Russian defense minister, the Ukrainian defense minister, and the U.S. defense minister in Ukraine, agreeing on jointly deactivating and removing Ukrainian nuclear, the former Soviet nuclear weapons in Ukraine. And somebody mentioned here the megatons to megawatts programs. The weapons were dismantled, sent to Russia. The fuel was reprocessed for peaceful reactors. And for 20 years, when this program was in action, up to 30% of consumer electricity produced in nuclear power stations in the United States came from the former Soviet nuclear weapons. This is an incredible result of cooperation built on trust and transparency. But we lost that. And I will come back to the lessons. We do have these lessons, but somehow we just are unable to put them in real life. Empathy, trust, and transparency, and compromise rather than toughness. Thank you very much.